Hi, I'm Ben. I founded a little company called Whiteboard Advisors about 15 years ago. I started it my first semester at Georgetown Law School, which is it was a totally separate like entrepreneurial story and something I wouldn't necessarily advise. But I was working with my wife at the time, so that made balance things out a little bit more. I'm going to tell a little story about a company I've been working with called General Assembly. Has anybody ever heard of General Assembly? Okay, so like the sort of coding bootcamp phenomenon and what really is sort of representative of the growth of unaccredited education providers. So how many of you are like MBA students? Great, so what does that cost? What is it? 100 grand? Okay, got it. It's a lot of money. And how long does it take?
3 years.
Okay, 3 years. So there's this massive, right, like and I don't know how many post-secondary institutions we have within like 3 or 4 miles of here, but you have this like massive sort of entrenched bureaucracy of post-secondary institutions that are charging massive amounts of money and have huge overhead. It's not all passed on to the brilliant professors that you have, right? But if you think about like Uber is sort of front page news, right? And the sort of paradigmatic story of the entrepreneur going up against like the entrenched bureaucracy is like very much becoming sort of a part of the startup ethos. Hard in many ways to imagine a more entrenched bureaucracy than post-secondary education, and in some ways, although in some ways, is sort of this emerging sector of which General Assembly is in some ways sort of emblematic, is challenging that bureaucracy. So that's I just say that by way of like context. In 2014, we were working with General Assembly. We were relatively early into our work with General Assembly, although I had worked with and known the founder, a guy by the name of Jake Schwartz, for some time. There's like two sort of great little, maybe 2 or 3 themes in this story. You had the Goose Example, so I'll try to like follow that. The one is like. As Evan learned tonight, ignorance is no excuse, and 2 is make friends before you need them. So 2014, the sort of Uber phenomenon, I'd done a bunch of writing on this, was sort of front page news. Companies like Airbnb were fighting the bureaucracy. We can discuss later like how much of that was sort of thoughtful and whether people took the right sort of policy approach on some of those issues in hindsight, like whether they followed the path of least resistance. But all of that's going on. This community of coding boot camps concentrated around the Bay Area. So companies like Hack Reactor and App Academy, this whole sort of emerging industry of boot camps, all received cease and desist letters from the Bureau of Private Post-Secondary Education in the state of California, right? So that's not good. Like, and what do they do? I remember I was like in Prague at the time. It was like 4 o'clock in the morning. And I was on the phone with all the CEOs of these various companies, and they're just completely freaking out, right? Like, oh my gosh, like we need to totally go Uber on them, or we're gonna run ads, and we're disrupting higher education. Like none of that is like raise your hand if you think you might just like drop out of Georgetown and go to General Assembly, right? Like not a lot of hands going up. So there's this like issue, right, kind of in the startup community where entrepreneurs, I think, become really self-righteous, right, about this stuff, and they sort of have they're solving these massive, big, like complex problems and disrupting these established industries that have been around for thousands and thousands of years. But on the other side of it is like they're running educational programs in the state of California. Like the state of California regulates the delivery of, well, not even so much the delivery, but just like basic consumer protection standards for education programs, right? So at the end of the day, like this, and by the way, like the consultants come out of the woodwork, right? Like people are gonna run ads and political campaigns and grassroots public affairs initiatives to talk about how people are being ripped off by traditional post-secondary education, and the boot camps are gonna like save the day. But at the end of the day, like you have these folks in the Bureau of Private Post-Secondary Education who are well-intentioned. Like the boot camp model is like relatively nascent, and they were legitimately concerned about consumer protection, right? Like people are paying $15,000 or $20,000, which isn't 100, but it's a lot of money. They're primarily financing it on their own. Like how do you know what the ROI on that investment is? How do you ensure that there's a consistent program? If someone's only hired 10 professors over a period of a few years, like what happens if you get the bad one? You're out 18 months and 20 grand, and that's not really cool, right? So we worked very closely with General Assembly. General Assembly, after sort of digesting like this cease and desist letter, which is pretty serious threat, having raised at this point now like close to $75 million. I mean, they have real sort of fiduciary obligations to shareholders and have to sort of make the right decision on this. But after sort of digesting all of that, we start to take a look at the different states and figure out what the rules of the road are. And they're sort of Byzantine and they're outdated, like most rules that sort of are not designed to regulate the entities with which they're now charged with regulating are. And at the end of the day, like they weren't really that bad, right? Like it was sort of a pain, and it took some thought. They had to hire some lawyers. They spent far less on lawyers than they would have if they were like blowing up the system of higher education, right? But so we took sort of a deliberate path. General Assembly was smart because they again, ignorance not being an excuse, we took a look at the regulatory environment in advance, right? So much of the discussion around sort of disruption and regulatory hacking, right? Like fails to take into account like basic like tenets of public policy and politics, right? Like most of these models aren't really that new, but most of the entrepreneurs and investors haven't been around that long, are operating in regulatory markets that long, and so there's not that much that's really new under the sun, and in many cases there are like historic analogs that we can look to as precedent when working to sort of either contort regulations to emerging models or shape the contours of a business plan to fit within an existing regulatory framework. So General Assembly was smart. They realized early that they were operating in a regulated environment. They began to make the case. So Tim talked earlier about framing. So we began to make the case in terms of the economic development value, in terms of their role in addressing the skills gap, and in a really, in a sort of a substantive and thoughtful way. And lo and behold, while much of the industry was like forming advocacy groups and hiring lobbyists and doing all that stuff, we were sort of like thoughtfully and quietly working with this like really boring consultant that had worked with the Bureau of Private Post-Secondary Education for like 100 years and learning the rules of the road. And we were learning the rules of the road in Illinois and in Massachusetts and in Georgia and in Texas. And while everyone else is sort of like freaking out, all the while not operating legally, we wound up licensed in 12 states. So if you go take a General Assembly course over at 1776 here in the district, you'll be at a legally operating private post-secondary institution. So I think the three sort of like key takeaways there is one like more often than not, I think institutional memories are short. Venture capital and to a lesser extent, I think the private equity community today is increasingly sort of interested in tackling complex and policy-related issues. But there's not a lot of sort of historic context circulating, and businesses that don't seem like they're operating in regulatory environments in many cases are. As Tim said, businesses that don't seem to be operating in regulatory environments in many cases are. And so when you're approaching a business from a very early stage, understanding the extent to which you're impacted by the regulatory environment at the outset seems sort of obvious, but is often overlooked and can be a real game changer for businesses. Two, I'd say, make friends before you need them. Seems obvious too, but if you're starting a business in the United States of America, with the exception of like the district, you're operating a state, like you're operating a city. Cities have mayors, city council members. Like their job is to engage with entrepreneurs and with businesses operating within their purview, and more often than not, they're helpful. So again, making friends before you need them can be really valuable. Thinking about the historic context and understanding the regulatory environment is really important. And I would sort of push against this sort of knee-jerk, hacking sort of the regulatory environment approach that that's becoming like increasingly pervasive, and encourage, in many cases, more thoughtful deliberation. There's always times when you need to just like blow stuff up, but that's a lot less frequent than I think you would think by reading the newspaper. So anyway, yeah.